I should have trusted my instincts that day. Something about the way he showed up unannounced, boots caked in mud, a sly grin tugging at the corners of his mouth, made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain. He'd always been charming, a little too charming for my taste, but I'd never felt uneasy around him. Not until that moment. "Your husband around?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe like he owned the place. "No, he's in town," I said, crossing my arms. "What do you need? Mark?" He shrugged, his dark eyes scanning me with a boldness that made my cheeks flush. "Just thought I'd drop by, lend a hand if you needed it. I know how much there is to do around here." It wasn't uncommon for Mark to swing by the farm. He and my husband had been friends since childhood, practically inseparable. But there was something different about him today, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His gaze lingered a second too long, his smile a little too knowing. "I've got it under control," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks, though." "Come on," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You're all alone out here. Let me help." The air in the room shifted as he moved closer, and for a moment, I felt trapped. But then I shook the thought away. This was Mark, my husband's best friend. I was imagining things. "Fine," I said, stepping back to put some distance between us. "You can help me with the fence in the north pasture. It's falling apart again." He smiled, that same cocky grin that always made me roll my eyes, and nodded. "Lead the way." As we walked out to the pasture, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just tired from the endless work on the farm, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, there he was, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. We worked in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic pounding of the hammer as I secured a loose board. Mark stood a few feet away, leaning against the fence post, his arms crossed as he watched me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Are you going to help, or are you just going to stand there?" I asked, more sharply than I intended. He smirked, pushing off the post and sauntering over to me. "Relax. I'm here, aren't I?" He took the hammer from my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I quickly stepped back, pretending to adjust the brim of my hat. My heart was racing, and I hated myself for it. This was Mark. Why was I reacting like this? "You always this jumpy?" he asked, his voice low and teasing. "No," I said, my tone defensive. "I'm just not used to having company out here." "Is that so?" he said, glancing over at me with a look that made my stomach flip. "Seems like you could use a little company." I ignored him, focusing on the task at hand, but no matter how hard I tried to concentrate, I couldn't ignore the way his presence seemed to fill the space around me. The way his voice seemed to wrap around me like a warm, suffocating blanket. By the time we finished with the fence, the sun was dipping low in the sky. I wiped the sweat from my brow, grateful for the excuse to head back to the house. But as we walked, Mark stayed close. Too close. Every brush of his arm against mine sent a spark through my body that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. When we reached the house, I turned to him, desperate to end whatever this was before it went any further. "Thanks for your help, Mark. I can take it from here." He didn't move, didn't even blink. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "You sure about that?" The air between us was electric, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't deny. My breath hitched, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think. His hand reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, and I felt my resolve start to crumble. "Mark, this isn't—" "Don't tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice a whisper. "Don't tell me I'm the only one." I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew he wasn't. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to avoid him, tried to pretend that nothing had happened, but he was always there, dropping by the farm under the pretense of helping out, finding excuses to linger just a little too long. And every time he looked at me, every time he smiled that infuriatingly cocky smile, I felt myself unraveling a little more. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just a bit of harmless flirting. But deep down, I knew better. I knew this was dangerous, that I was playing with fire, and yet I couldn't seem to stop myself. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the wind outside. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard the knock at the door. My heart sank. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Mark was standing there, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a bottle of wine in his hand. "Thought you might need a little company," he said, his smile as smooth as ever. "Mark, it's late," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come on," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Just one drink." I should have told him to leave. I should have slammed the door in his face. But instead, I found myself pouring 2 glasses of wine and sitting across from him at the kitchen table. The conversation started out innocent enough, talking about the farm, about my husband, about the long hours and the endless work. But as the night wore on, the tension between us grew thicker, more suffocating. Every glance, every brush of his hand against mine felt like a spark threatening to ignite the fire we were both trying so hard to deny. "You deserve more, you know," he said, his voice low and serious. "Mark," I started, but he shook his head. "No, listen to me," he said, leaning closer. "You work so hard, give so much, and what do you get in return? You're out here all alone, carrying the weight of this place on your shoulders. You deserve better." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I couldn't speak because deep down I knew he was right. The rest of that night was a blur. All I remember is the way his hand felt on mine, the way his voice wrapped around me like a promise, the way my heart raced as I teetered on the edge of a decision I couldn't take back. When I woke up the next morning, the weight of what had happened hit me like a freight train. I told myself it was a mistake, that it could never happen again. But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie, because some part of me didn't want it to end. The days that followed felt like I was living in a haze, a strange mixture of guilt and longing swirling in my chest. I avoided looking at the kitchen table where we had sat that night, where everything had changed. I avoided my reflection in the mirror, unable to face the woman staring back at me. And most of all, I avoided Mark. At least, I tried to. He came back to the farm the next day as if nothing had happened, his easy smile and confident demeanor masking the storm that raged beneath the surface. Every time I saw him, my heart raced, my skin prickling with awareness. I told myself to stay away, to put distance between us. But Mark had other plans. He found excuses to linger, a broken tractor that needed fixing, a shipment of feed that needed unloading. And every time he showed up, I felt the walls I'd built around myself start to crack. One afternoon, I finally confronted him. "You can't keep coming here," I said, my voice firm but trembling at the edges. He leaned against the barn door, his arms crossed, that maddening smirk playing on his lips. "Why not? I'm just helping out." "Mark, you know why," I said, stepping closer, my fists clenched at my sides. "Do I?" he asked, his tone teasing but his eyes sharp. "Because I don't see the problem. Unless—" He trailed off, his gaze locking onto mine, daring me to say it. "Unless what?" I snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Unless you're afraid," he said softly, his voice dropping into a tone that sent shivers down my spine. "Afraid of what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "Afraid of how you feel when I'm around. Afraid that maybe, just maybe, you don't want me to stop coming here." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't speak, because he wasn't wrong. That night, I stayed awake long after the sun went down, staring at the ceiling and replaying his words over and over in my mind. I hated how easily he got under my skin, how effortlessly he made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. When I finally drifted off to sleep, it was restless, filled with dreams I couldn't shake when I woke. The next morning, I threw myself into my work, desperate to drown out the thoughts that threatened to consume me. But it didn't take long for Mark to show up again, this time unannounced as always. I was in the barn, stacking hay bales, when I heard his voice behind me. "You work too hard, you know that?" I turned to see him leaning against the barn door, his arms crossed and that familiar grin on his face. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just checking on you," he said, stepping inside. "You seemed tense yesterday." "I'm fine," I said, turning back to the hay bales, but he didn't leave. Instead, he walked over and stood behind me, so close I could feel the heat radiating off his body. "You don't look fine," he said, his voice soft and teasing. I spun around, my patience finally snapping. "What is it you want from me, Mark? Why can't you just leave me alone?" His smirk faded, replaced by something darker, more serious. "You know why?" I opened my mouth to argue, but he cut me off, stepping closer and forcing me to look up at him. "Stop fighting it," he said, his voice low and intense. "Stop pretending you don't feel it too." I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, caught in the intensity of his gaze. "This isn't right," I whispered, my voice trembling. He said, his lips curving into a small, almost sad smile. "But that doesn't make it any less real." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me abrasive and shaken, because deep he was right. The tension between us reached a breaking point that night. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when he knocked on this door. I didn't want to answer, but something compelled me to. When I opened the door, he was standing there, a bottle of whiskey in his hand and a look in his eyes that sent my heart racing. "I think we need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Mark, this isn't—" "Sit down," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. I hesitated for a moment before reluctantly sitting at the table. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and slid one across to me before taking the seat across from me. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low and raw. "Every time I close my eyes, you're there. Every time I'm here, I don't want to leave. And I know you feel it too." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come, because they would have been a lie. "This has to stop," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Why?" he asked, leaning closer. "Because it's wrong? Because it's complicated? Or because you're afraid of what it means?" I didn't answer because I didn't know what to say. "Tell me to leave," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "If you really want me to, I'll walk out that door and never come back. But you have to mean it." My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I stared at him. I wanted to tell him to leave, to end whatever this was before it went any further. But the words wouldn't come. "Mark." He stood up, walking around the table to stand in front of me. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek, and I closed my eyes, unable to fight the pull any longer. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, his voice soft and full of promise. And in that moment, I let go. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered confessions. Every glance, every touch, every breath between us felt like a secret we couldn't keep, but couldn't let go of. I told myself it couldn't last, that it had to end. But every time I thought about walking away, the thought of losing him was too much to bear. And then, one day, everything came crashing down. My husband came home early. I was in the barn with Mark when I heard the truck pull up. My heart stopped, panic flooding my veins as I realized what was about to happen. "Go!" I hissed, shoving Mark toward the back door. He hesitated for a moment before nodding, slipping out the door just as my husband walked in. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me. "Nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just working on the hay bales." He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband, my heart heavy with guilt and regret. I knew what I had to do. I knew it couldn't go on. But as I closed my eyes, all I could think about was Mark. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I was already in too deep.